Okay, so I'm calling the class our state and municipal kosher laws kosher. And what I want to look at is not only kosher laws, but if we get to it, the subject of what are known as get laws. A get meaning a Jewish divorce, because in both cases, they are essentially attempts to solve really internal parochial Jewish problems through use of the civil court system, and the question of how legal that is, and there's an interesting history as well as one particular fact that I came across earlier today as I was preparing for this class. All right, so I want to look first of all at kosher enforcement laws. And the reason that these laws came into being is there's what's known in Hebrew as hefkerut, which I guess I would translate in this context as anarchy, right? In terms of kosher supervision. And there were certainly cases in the 20s and 30s in New York City, where, according to histories that I've read, the majority of kosher butchers were selling out and out treif meat. It was just completely fraudulent. And so cities or states sought to step in, and these were seen as consumer protection laws, right? They were seen as consumer protection laws. If I go into the store and I buy a product that says kosher on the label, I should be able to expect that it's actually kosher, right? In the same way that if I go into the store and the product is labeled fat-free, I expect it to be fat-free, right? If the product says no sodium, I expect that it should have no sodium, right? So in what way is kosher different, right? And so I should be able to expect that if the product says kosher, it should be kosher, right? What's wrong with that? And I'm asking that as a question. What's wrong with that? Alan, go ahead. You can people just jump right in.
On the one hand, Rabbi, I understand you could say something's wrong with that because it's an intermixing of religion and the civil law, but it's not. Your point is correct. It is a fraudulent act, and that's where the consumer laws get involved. So if you didn't say it was kosher, that's fine. If you say something else, if you're deceptive in your practice, that's when the civil law, I think, should and does step in. But the other side of this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So there's political pressure. And if you're in New York City and you've got a strong constituent of people that give a darn about kosher products, you want them to be your voters. But I think the bottom line is it's appropriate because you have to avoid deceptive practices.
Okay, so anybody else want to jump in on this? Yeah, Stan.
There's also different levels of kosher, whether it's a circle U or a K with a star, without a star, and it has different meanings. So you have to know the different meanings. I mean, there was a time where Hebrew National was marked as kosher, and it wasn't accepted by the Orthodox community because they wouldn't pay the heck wouldn't pay Mashgiach.
Right. All right, and Stan, that I think is part of the issue, right? In other words, there is a generally accepted definition of fat-free, right? If it says fat-free, right, nobody, I mean, there's no like ambiguity about what is the definition of fat-free, right? Now, low fat is different, but I expect that there are government definitions of what low fat or low sodium means, right? But when it comes to kosher, there's no universally accepted definition of the word kosher, right? In other words, Marilyn, go ahead.
And there's also no universal definition of natural
Correct.
with food.
Right. Right. There's no definition, and people often think that natural means organic. It doesn't. They're totally different things. But I do think there's maybe no universally accepted one, but there probably is a government definition of what natural means. I'm not really sure. There certainly is a government definition of organic, and you can't label something organic unless it is. I mean, but for example, I mean, is swordfish kosher? Right? Is swordfish kosher? Well, the conservative movement says it is. Most Orthodox rabbis say it isn't. And, you know, I've read articles by Orthodox rabbis saying, well, it really is, but because the conservatives say it is, we can't say that it is. I read a couple of those, and so I changed my own position on it. I mean, in principle, I used to not eat swordfish. I mean, since I changed my position, I still haven't actually eaten it, but in principle, I would. I now believe it to be kosher, right? Or when people ask me, you know, do we need kosher cheese in the synagogue? I say, of course we need kosher cheese. We don't need kosher certified cheese, right? Because our position as the conservative movement is that essentially, absent, you know, certain additives or whatever, all cheese is kosher. It doesn't need kosher certification, right? So there's no universal objective determination of what the word kosher actually means, right? So I want to talk about a couple of cases. There was an ordinance in Baltimore City which created a Bureau of Kosher Enforcement. It was headed by an Orthodox rabbi, and it said kosher. Most of these laws have historically said kosher means conforming with Orthodox Hebrew requirements. And why Orthodox Hebrew and not Orthodox Jewish? I think it's because they go back a century or more when Jew was a dirty word. And so Hebrew was a more refined term. But I would say that even within Orthodoxy, there's still no universally accepted, but the head of the Kosher Law Enforcement Bureau in Baltimore City was an Orthodox rabbi, somebody I've actually met, Rabbi Meir Kurtzfeld. In 1990, a guy by the name of George Barghouti, who was a Palestinian American and owned a store called Yogurt Plus, and he was cited for violating the law. He had a one of those rotating hot dog grills. And he sold kosher hot dogs, and he had kosher and non-kosher hot dogs on the same grill, which, as far as I'm concerned, makes them no longer kosher, right? Even if they started as kosher, you're getting grease from the non-kosher.
Right.
And he was cited. He refused to sign the citation. He was cited about 5 times, never paid his fine, and he finally sued the city. And the law was ruled unconstitutional because it essentially attempted to define kosher. And the other thing is that one of the reasons is that it required intent. And Barghouti said, look, I legitimately believe this to be kosher, right? And therefore you telling me that it's not kosher is establishing a standard. The city lost in the state court. It lost in the federal district court, and then it went to the federal appeals court in Richmond, Virginia. And in 1995, the appeals court affirmed the lower court's ruling 3-0. One of the judges in that ruling was a gentleman by the name of J. Michael Lutic, which is a name that should be familiar to everybody. At this juncture, he gave very, very moving testimony before the House January 6th committee today. A very, very conservative justice, but one who nevertheless believes in democracy is more important than my side winning. But that was just an interesting little piece of trivia. There were similar rulings in New York State, which also had a Bureau of Kosher Law Enforcement headed by an Orthodox rabbi, and in New Jersey. And in both cases, unlike the Baltimore case, right? In both cases, in New York and New Jersey, the plaintiffs who sued and ultimately won were butchers or delis that had conservative supervision. Okay, and this is where it gets really tricky, right? Because to determine that, kosher means conforming with Orthodox Hebrew requirements is telling me that as a conservative rabbi, I can't give hashgacha, right? And that's completely unacceptable. Yeah, Sue.
Well, I was wondering, in the case of the hot dog seller, so a Muslim would eat kosher hot dogs because they conform to their standard. But
Right.
I think that as long as it would be beef, that they probably wouldn't have a major problem putting those hot dogs on a grill with other beef hot dogs. I could be wrong. So in that respect, he still would have, because he was selling the kosher hot dogs, he would still have to meet the Orthodox, the Orthodox way of doing it, even though maybe those were not the constituents that he was selling it to.
Well, I mean, look, by the time that I lived in Baltimore and I moved there in 2001, I don't recall that shop. I mean, I'm sure that it was in the area where I live, because that's the only place in Baltimore City that there's enough observant Jews that it would be even worthwhile to attempt to sell kosher hot dogs. but the question, I mean, from my perspective, it's really caveat emptor, right? In other words, if you keep kosher and you care about kashrut, and somebody claims that this is kosher, right? Show me why you make that claim, right? Show me why you make that claim. Now, in the cases in New York and New Jersey, they did have certification, but it came from a conservative rabbi, right? And so I don't remember the details of what the issue was, but in one, and I don't honestly don't remember whether it was the New York or the New Jersey case, but no, it must have been New York, where the butcher store was cited by the Orthodox rabbi who headed the Kosher Enforcement Bureau for improperly preparing beef tongues. And the thing is that the guy said, look, the rabbi who gives me certification tells me that the way I prepare them is the way I have to prepare them, right? The way I have to prepare them. So my certifying rabbi is telling me to do X, and the state's rabbi is saying, no, X makes it treif, right? I mean, this is precisely the establishment of religion, right? The state has decided that this rabbi's procedure of how to prepare beef tongue is correct and properly kosher, and this other rabbi's procedure is incorrect and wrong. And
Rabbi, but with all due respect, and you're saying that bothers you, I really believe that shows that the law does handle these things properly. That in order to avoid deceptive practices, you have to be within the secular definition of kosher. And Stan mentioned the different certifying bodies. That's fine. But if you have evidence, credible evidence that somebody's certifying this, and I think arguably you could say that if a Reform rabbi gives you the certification, you can go into court and show that. The law is not to decide which branch of the Jewish religion is more appropriate. It's to say that this is certified and it's not deceptive.
right, but what they were doing up to this point was not what you were saying. They were determining which branch was correct and which branch incorrect, okay? And so in both Maryland and New York and New Jersey, those laws were struck down and replaced by precisely what you're advocating, okay? Which is exactly what you will find in at least those three states and many more. For example, I mean, there's no clearer example of this than when Wegmans first opened in Germantown, and they had at the time a kosher deli and kosher rotisserie chickens. And I was asked, because they opened shortly after I got here. And Rabbi, can we use this for the shul? And I said, no. Why not? It's kosher. Well, it may be kosher, I don't know, but it has no certification, right? It's self-certified. And if you went to Wegmans at the time, you would have found on that counter a state-provided form that said, on what basis do we claim this to be kosher, right? And the answer was essentially, all products that we use in this department are certified kosher, We use separate utensils for preparing the kosher products. We use a separate slicer for kosher meat, another separate slicer for kosher cheese. Who is the certifying agent? No one, self-certified, right? So if that's good enough for you, es gesundte Heid, right? It's not good enough for the shul, right? Because there needs to be some level of certification. But was Wegmans deceptive? No, absolutely not. They were not deceptive, right? If you wanted to, they had a plausible basis for claiming everything to be kosher. I'm quite confident that everything came in kosher, right? I'm less confident that they were stringent about only slicing kosher meat on the kosher slicer, because there's nobody certifying it, right? What happens if the other slicer breaks down and somebody comes in and wants a pound of ham? Are they going to say, we can't sell you any ham today because the slicer is broken, or are they just going to go and slice it on the kosher slicer? I don't know. But can you tell me it's impossible? No. I mean, it could even happen if there was a mashgiach, but it's less likely to happen, right? Mistakes get made. So, as a consumer protection piece of legislation that requires you to disclose the basis for your kosher claims, and then if you make kosher claims and you do say, now in Wegmans' case, they said, we certify it ourselves, right? If you have a certifying rabbi, then the form is, what denomination does the rabbi belong to? What is his or her training? How frequently does the rabbi visit, right? Because there's all different, there's, even within Orthodoxy, right? The question is, generally for meat, you require a mashgiach tamidi, that any time the place is open, there has to be a mashgiach. For dairy, generally spot checks are okay. Okay, but even so, there's a difference between a spot check twice a week and a difference between a spot check twice a year. Right? If you trust it, you trust it, but you have a right to know what is the basis for those claims, right? And all of these laws have been found to be constitutional because they don't establish a religion, they don't establish standards, they don't decide between competing sects or competing interpretations, right? They just require you, if you're gonna claim it's kosher, disclose the basis for your claim, right? And these laws are fine and helpful and useful, right? I think so, and I have no problem with them, and they have, to my knowledge, to whenever they've gotten to court, which they're pretty much not even getting to court because they've been affirmed, time and time again, right? But this would not prevent me from giving certification to an establishment. I haven't done so around here, but in Baltimore, I did. In Baltimore, the conservative rabbis, when I was there were two establishments that were under conservative hashgacha. There was a deli, which is now under the Star K, and there was an assisted living. And it wasn't in my name; it was in the name of the conservative rabbis of Greater Baltimore. But I was the one who was doing the supervision and practice. And if somebody had said, "Oh, well, you can't because you're a conservative rabbi," I think that would have been a violation of my free exercise rights. But to require disclosure, I think is not really an issue. Now, I want to talk about a couple of lawsuits. One less recent and one more recent. I was going to talk about the more recent one first, but since Stan mentioned Hebrew National, I'll talk about the less recent one first. Okay, so the issue with Hebrew National is that, and you say the Orthodox community, I want to tell you, it wasn't just the Orthodox community. I would not, when I was the Hillel director at American University, I would not allow us to use Hebrew National. And when I was the mashgiach at the University of Judaism, the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, I would not allow the cafeteria to serve Hebrew National, which led to me getting a very angry call from the distributor of Hebrew National in the Los Angeles area, who was a member of a conservative synagogue, but I didn't back down, okay? But the issue with Hebrew National at the time was that the rabbi who certified Hebrew National, A, was an employee of Hebrew National, and B, at the time that I had this friendly discussion with the Hebrew National distributor, the rabbi was not only an employee of Hebrew National, he was also deceased. And nevertheless, although deceased, still giving certification for Hebrew National. After a while, they concluded that it was untenable to have hashgacha from a dead rabbi. I mean, if the dead rabbi had been, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, maybe, but he wasn't. And they went to the Triangle K certifying agency. Okay, and at that point, the Kashrut subcommittee of the RA Law Committee met with Triangle K and went to the Hebrew National Factory and ruled that Triangle K is reliable. Okay, and now, I mean, I eat Hebrew National, we serve it in the shul, et cetera, et cetera. The issue for the Orthodox community is twofold. One is that it is kosher but not glatt. Okay, and it is legitimately kosher but not glatt. In other words, they don't claim to be glatt kosher. Okay, and briefly, because this is not a law on kashrut, but for those of you who aren't clear on what is the difference between regular kosher and glatt kosher, when you slaughter a 4-footed animal, the lungs have to be inspected, right? And if there are certain what's called sirchas, certain adhesions on the lungs, they call over another rabbi called a bodek and inspect, and the bodek checks. Okay, and if the bodek says, yeah, it's kosher, then it's kosher but not glatt kosher, because glatt means smooth, and glatt does not mean very kosher or super kosher, or the rabbi has a long beard. Glatt means there are no sirchas on the lungs. All right, so the Orthodox community, by and large, says even if the bodek passes it as kosher, we're still not going to eat it. Okay, and that's a legitimate standard. I mean, although until 50 years ago, the only people who followed that were Hasidim, but now we have this stringency creep and the art scrollization of the American Jewish community. And so now it's become the normative expectation. And so, if you ask, an intellectually honest Orthodox rabbi, they'll say, we trust Triangle K. They're honest people, they're learned people, et cetera, but their standards are different than our standards. And that's perfectly fine and is perfectly legitimate, right? We don't insist on glot meat. And so, but then there's always the whisker, oh, he's not reliable, da 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 da. That's nonsense. I mean, the head of Triangle K is the rabbi of a young Israel in Brooklyn. He's a yeshiva teacher. He's Talmud Chacham. He's a learned guy. He just certifies, and his argument is, look, I mean, there are people who are very happy to eat basic kosher who don't require glot. And if we insist that everything be glot, it's going to be more expensive and people won't eat it, right? People will just eat treif. All right. So, but if glot is what you need, then this isn't for you. And that's fine. That's fine. It's not a problem. But a few years ago, there was a federal lawsuit against ConAgra, which owns Hebrew National. The lawyer was basically one of these guys who makes his money on like thinking up class action lawsuits and then finding plaintiffs. And the basis for the claim was the ads for Hebrew National said, we follow the highest standards of Orthodox rabbis. And so we assumed that it was glot. And now we find that it's not glot. Oh my God, we're all going to hell because we ate non-glot meat, give us millions of dollars. Tossed out of court because they never claimed to be glot. I mean, if they claimed to be glot and weren't, and then you could presumably have a plausible case. But highest standards, I think the court used the term as mere puffery. Right? There's no general definition of highest standards. So that case was thrown out of court.
Rabbi, don't they
more
say
rec-
the answer to a higher standard?
Well, right, their ads do say
Isn't there advertising, we answer to a higher standard?
right, but their website, I think, actually did say highest standards. I mean, the higher standards was contrasting it with USDA standards that, the USDA allows these kind of fillers and this is so, and we don't allow it because we're kosher. I think they said we answer to a higher authority, actually, higher authority. All right, so there was a case in Long Island. There's a restaurant called Chimichurri. It is a Brazilian barbecue chicken restaurant, kosher. And they have 2-3 branches, I'm not sure exactly, and they're in the 5 towns. The 5 towns is a heavily Orthodox area of Long Island, or sorry, I mispronounced it, Long Island. And for a long time, so there's the VOD of the 5 towns. VOD means committee. It's more probably Vad HaKashrut, and it was made up of all of the Orthodox pulpit rabbis in the 5 towns, like 50 rabbis, and they were the only agency giving certification of like restaurants and butchers, not products, obviously. I mean, you go to the kosher supermarket and things would be OU or okay or whatever, but the only agency that was certifying restaurants and butchers and bakeries was the VOD of the 5 towns. And a couple of years ago, 2 Sephardic pulpit rabbis, because there's a growing Sephardic population in the 5 towns, Great Neck in particular, there's a lot of Iranian Jews. And they started their own certification. And their fees were lower than the VODs, and Chimichurri went to this other agency called Mahadran of the 5 towns, And they switched to Mahadran of the Five Towns, and the VOD put out a statement saying, for X number of years, we had one unified agency, and the highest standards that everybody agreed on. And now this new agency comes, we cannot vouch for their standards, and we cannot recommend that our congregants patronize their establishments. Okay, and guess what? Chimichurri lost a lot of business, and so they sued. And basically, they claimed it was, restraint of trade, monopoly, slander, that you lied and said we aren't kosher. If you read the filing, they never said it wasn't kosher, right? They said we cannot recommend that you patronize these establishments, and they're very, very careful. Just in the same way that when people ask me about Wegmans, right, and I don't know if anybody here asked me, but I never said it wasn't kosher. I never said it wasn't kosher. I said it does not meet the standards that we require for our synagogue, which is absolutely a true statement, right? Now, if I could have even said I can't vouch for their standards, which is, which would be even a lower level of sort of doubt, but true statement, right? And so, it was pretty quickly thrown out of court. Because there's no basis. Now, having said that, would I, I haven't been to Long Island in a long time, but if I should find myself in Long Island, would I eat a chimichurri? Absolutely. I perfectly happy to rely on Mahadran of the Five Towns or the VOD. But I think the VOD has the right to say, we can't vouch for their standards. We don't recommend that, you patronize their establishment. I think that's absolutely legitimate. And the state has this was clearly, to my mind, excessive entanglement, right? That where quite literally the plaintiff asked the court to determine if this was really kosher or not kosher. Court's not going to do that. It's absolutely not going to do that, right? So, bottom line, consumer protection, yes. Establishing standards or defining what is or what is not kosher. No. Now, having said that, the demise of the New York kosher law had a detrimental impact on my life because, I have a lot of relatives in New York. At one point, New York was the only place in the country where there were still lots of kosher delis that had no certification, and you could reliably eat in them because the state was essentially, checking their kashrut. And so I would, if it said, kosher deli, I would eat there. And now if it says kosher deli, I have to, look and where's your certification, right? And if it doesn't have a certification, I'm not going to eat there anymore, right? But so, the kosher law was good for me personally, but it was bad for the Constitution. And, we have to put the Constitution against our own personal preference, or above, I should say. So, any questions or comments on kosher laws before I want to move on? We do have a little bit of time, so I want to move on to get laws. But if there's any question or comment on kosher laws, please go ahead. All right, so we'll move on to get laws, right? So one Hebrew term that you need to know, and that is aguna, right? Aguna means, actually, an ogen is an anchor. Okay, so an aguna is, if we were translated literally, an anchored woman. Okay, what it means is essentially a woman who is technically married according to halakha, and therefore cannot, but she's not living or able to live with her husband, and she's functionally single, but can't marry because she is an aguna. I mean, there are two different types of agunot. One which is not the subject of this discussion, but for sake of fullness, is somebody whose husband has simply disappeared. Simply disappeared. Maybe they were a sailor, whatever, they've disappeared. Okay, so unlike civil law, where a person can disappear off the face of the earth, and after a certain amount of time, you can go to court and have them declared legally dead, right? And then you can remarry. No such thing in halakha. I mean, no such thing in halakha, so that even if they were a sailor and somebody saw the ship sink, how do you know for sure he's dead, right? Maybe he floated to the surface and was washed up on an island and, can't get back to civilization, but he's still alive. All right, but that's pretty rare. The more common situation of an aguna is where they've had a civil divorce, but the husband refuses to give her a get, a Jewish divorce. Now, why is this a problem? Because in the Torah, where it talks about divorce, it says, "Vayichtov la sefer kritut." He shall write for her a bill of divorcement. Right? Very specific language. He shall write for her. Okay, which is one of the reasons why the laws are so complicated. For when you get married, you can go into a Judaica store and buy a blank ketubah for $5 and bring it to the rabbi, and they fill it in. That's it. You're done. Right? Now, people usually get a fancy or whatever, but you don't have to. Right? There's no such thing as going to the Jewish bookstore and buying a pre-printed get. It has to be written by hand by a scribe. And they'll say, "Vayichtov la," he shall write her. So the husband has to appoint the scribe as his agent, right? And then whatever the agent does, it's as if you did it, right? But vayichtov la, he shall write her, not she shall write for him, but he shall write for her, and not the court shall write for them or for her or for him. So if he refuses to do it, there is no get, period. Okay, so what does that mean? Right? Yeah, Gail.
Means she can't marry.
She can't marry, right? She can't marry because halachically she's still married, right? And this gives the husband, ex-husband, however you want to define it, a tremendous amount of power, because he can go, you want to give me custody of the children, right? You want to waive spousal support. You want to pay me $100,000 and I'll give you a get, right? And within the Orthodox system, there's no way to resolve this. Okay, now within conservative Judaism, there is a way to resolve it, called Hafka'at Kiddushin, which essentially means annulment. And the theory is, right, when you get married, it's Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, right, according to the law of Moses in Israel. And essentially, part of the law of Moses in Israel is don't be a jerk, right? So when you said Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, essentially you lied, so we can annul the marriage. I mean, that's a little quick and dirty, but basically that's so. But within Orthodoxy, there's basically no such thing, right? So if I'm an Orthodox woman and I have a civil divorce but no get, and now I found this other guy that I want to marry, and for my own personal conscience reasons, I can only be married by an Orthodox rabbi, I'm out of luck. I'm out of luck, right? Yeah, Gail.
Well, it makes it worse. I mean, if she did marry, now she has a kid and the kid's really sunk.
Right, the kid is a mom's heir. Exactly, the kid is a mom's heir, right? So it's a problem. Okay, it's a problem. Now, so mostly in states with large Jewish populations, Jewish organizations have gone to the legislature and said, pass a law to fix this. All right. And it would, within the last, I don't know exactly 2, 3, 4 years, such a law was passed in the Maryland legislature and signed by Governor Hogan. And the JCRC supported it. I think I was still on the JCRC board at the time. I opposed it vociferously because I think if we can't set our house in order, that's not the state legislature's problem, frankly. Okay. But there have been attempts. The first was, and this is within the conservative movement, there's known as the Lieberman Clause, okay? Chances are, if your marriage was officiated at by a conservative rabbi, whether you knew it or not, you got a ketubah that had the Lieberman Clause in it. Okay, what is the Lieberman Clause? The Lieberman Clause essentially says that both parties agree that if this marriage will be dissolved in civil court, either party can summon the other party to the joint Beit Din of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Rabbinical Assembly, and the other party will answer the summons and do as instructed. Okay. In 1982, I think it was, this went to court in New York. The case was Avitzur versus Avitzur, and the courts ruled that this was valid because essentially it was a civil contract. The fact that it is a civil contract written in Aramaic and witnessed by a rabbi doesn't matter, right? There's no, I'm not aware of any law that says contracts, in order to be valid, have to be written in English, right? I mean, they could be written in, right? Am I correct that they could be written in any language?
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
So this was held up as valid. The problem was that the Lieberman Clause doesn't really have a lot of teeth, right? Because you're basically committing to appear before the Beit Din. You're not really committing to do any specific thing, right? So aside from this, that the Orthodox community doesn't like it because it's a conservative Beit Din, right? And again, if you ask certain Orthodox rabbis, they say, well, the Lieberman clause really is fine, except that Lieberman taught at JTS, and therefore we can't accept it. But if Lieberman, if instead of the Lieberman clause, it was the Soloveitchik clause, it would be fine. But subsequent to that, the legislature passed what's called the New York Get Law, which says that anyone who was married in a religious ceremony and subsequently has a civil divorce must remove any impediments to the partner's remarriage that is solely within their power to resolve before the final divorce decree will be given, right? In other words, right, I am divorced, God forbid, divorcing my wife. We go to court. The court agrees in principle to the divorce, but says, you both have to certify that you have removed any impediments that is solely within your possibility to remove, and then we'll give you the final decree. Now, it had to be written in that way because the solely within your power to remove is really important, right? Because otherwise Catholics couldn't get divorced in New York, right? Because those impediments cannot be removed by the parties. They can only be removed by the canon law court granting an annulment, which happens, although it doesn't happen as frequently as Bate Din or supervising gets, right? So look, the argument is that you freely chose to enter into a marriage under religious auspices, right? But people do change their minds, right? People change their minds, and suppose I was Jewish and now I no longer believe in Judaism. I still have to go, right? Then the argument is it's not really a religious act; it's a civil act. It's just a civil act under a different legal system. I mean, I personally have problems with these laws. I mean, I understand the rationale, but if frankly, if somebody comes to me, if an Orthodox woman came to me and said, I have a civil divorce, my husband won't give me a get, what should I do? I would say, turn it over to me. I'll present your case to the joint Beit Din, and I'll marry you. But then she'll say, but I'm not conservative, I'm Orthodox. Well, that's your problem. I mean, that's your problem. It's not really the legislature's problem. So I don't like these laws, but they seem to have been upheld by the courts. So, Alan, you've been shaking your head a lot, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Thank you. This really fascinates me because, of course, you see this. The one I always think about was here in Gaithersburg, and the folks lived in Deer Park, and the neighbors really complained because the community, the Orthodox community for this lady, were trying to help her, and they had these demonstrations every Sunday, and the neighbors were really upset about it. Sure. And I think what ultimately happened was that the man who lived there moved away, but it is a problem, and to me, though, it comes down to you got to pick your poison. Either you're going to buy into the system and be governed in your mind by the halakha, or you come to a more, what I would consider more reasonable, but the law really can't go too far because of the excessive entanglement. But I find this interesting, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, look, there is another way of resolving this, okay? Which, I mean, and there are there are Brooklyn rabbis in federal penitentiaries right now for resorting to this alternative, okay, which is, hire a couple of starkers with tire irons to show up at the guy's house and say, you think you don't want to give her a get, but you really do, right? And my friend Morty the tire iron says that you do, right? And look, and Maimonides says that that's what you should do, right? Because Maimonides says, no, his argumentation is very interesting, because part of the problem is the husband has to give the get willingly. Okay, if you threaten him with violence, how is it willingly, right? And that is the Orthodox argument against all of these laws, frankly, right? There's an internal Orthodox argument that says the get is not valid because it's not given willingly. And if it's not given willingly, then we get back to the same problem that Gail said, that subsequent children are mamzerim, right? But Maimonides says essentially every Jew wants to do the will of God, but the Yetzer Hara, the evil urge, interferes. And so sometimes we need to beat the evil urge out of you so that you can be free to do what you really want to do. You just don't know that that's what you want to do. Obviously, Maimonides lived 900 years ago. We don't operate under the same system, but personally, I think it verges on a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, for the Jewish community to say to the legislature, we can't fix our own problems, you fix them for us. I have a problem with that. I also have a problem, obviously, with women being extorted or prevented from being remarried, right? So, sometimes maybe you hold your nose and you go along with something that seems constitutionally suspect. But anyway, these are my thoughts. Anybody else? Joe.
Yeah, but I just wanted to ask a question. Does the reform movement adhere to the get requirements also, or
No.
do they don't
No.
they don't abide by them? Okay.
They don't abide by them. They do
No.
have, as far as I know, you can get a religious divorce. In other words, that there are some people who feel, properly, in my opinion, that if we entered into the marriage under religious auspices, we ought to end the marriage under religious auspices as well. But it doesn't meet the requirement of a get. In other words, when I say pre-printed form that you just fill out, it is literally a pre-printed form that you just fill out. Believe me, I think most conservative rabbis would bend over backwards to try and find a way to not create agunot, right? But there's only so much you can do. The halacha is pretty clear. It's another reason why, the halacha is, in terms of gets very, very intricate. These are the things, like when somebody comes to me, I say, I can handle this for you in terms of shepherding you through the process. I am not trained to write a get. Okay, that's special training that, there are only about 20 conservative rabbis in the whole world who have that training. Similarly, like I had a case not that long ago. It was an interesting case, okay, where marriage, the woman had been married before, okay. her ex-husband was not Jewish when they got married, but converted to Judaism during the course of their marriage, right? But they never had a Jewish marriage, right? So does she need a get or not? Right now, according to the laws of the rabbinic, this is not something that I am qualified to decide on my own, right? Because she was married to a Jew, right? She was married to a Jew, doesn't have a get, right? So I cannot simply decide on my own, it's fine, right? So I went to the joint Beit Din, and the joint Beit Din essentially said, here's the first step. Find out if the ex-husband is willing to give a get. Okay? I mean, it may not be needed, but there's no harm, right? There's no harm in giving one, even if it's unnecessary, right? If the ex-husband won't give a get, then we'll take it one step further, right? But it turned out that the ex-husband was willing to give a get as long as he didn't have to pay for it, right? So the new husband paid for it. This is not cheap, by the way. I mean, because it's a complicated process. So that's not like no reflection on him, right? It's not for my benefit. Why should I have to pay for it, right? But for example, I mean, let's say that I had the special training, right? I suspect that if I had the special training and the special certification and somebody came to me and said, I need you to write a get, I would call up Rabbi Safra at B'nai Israel and say, can I borrow your library for a couple of hours to write a get? Okay, why? Because the name of the place where the get is written has to be in the get, and it has to be spelled properly. How do you spell Gaithersburg in Hebrew? It's not so simple. Spelling Rockville in Hebrew is simpler, right? So not to risk invalidating the get by misspelling the name of the place, we would probably all schlep to Rockville and write the get there. Okay, similarly, I mean, and this is not joking, right? I mean, if you're writing a get in Skokie, do you write Skokie or do you write Chicago? Right? I mean, these are right, and so Sam Irvin used to call himself, a simple country lawyer, right? Simple country lawyer with a law degree from Harvard, but nevertheless a simple old country lawyer, right? The simple old country rabbi doesn't deal with these things, right? Because if you make a mistake, the consequences are quite serious, right? So you have to have special training, special certification, and then you bend over backwards. Now, retroactively, right? Somebody came to me with a get, and I said, he wrote Gaithersburg with a tet, and I would have written it with a tav. You're an adulteress and your kids are mamzerim. No, I wouldn't do that either, right? But you try to avoid creating problems. All right. Good night. Thanks, everybody.
Rabbi, thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.